More hostages are expected to be freed on Saturday as questions mount about the future of the deal. The IDF chief of staff resigns in the shadow of October 7th. And perhaps you've heard there's a new president in Washington, and we really should talk about Elon Musk. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. Unholy, 2 Jews on the news. It's a blizzard in America of news, but a lot going on in our neck of the woods. Nevertheless, I thought we would make special mention of something that is not gloom and doom, but quite the opposite, which is a little tweet appeared saying that Meg Ryan says something iconic is happening with her and Billy Crystal. And the little post came along with a picture of the two of them on the iconic couch on which the two characters they both played, Harry and Sally, sat in the legendary film When Harry Met Sally. Now, obviously, you and I are very excited by this intriguing little clue. But also there's something a bit spooky about it because it suggests there's going to be something about When Harry Met Sally. Something's going to come back. Who knows what it will be? You know, could be a sequel, could be just an ad in the Super Bowl. Who knows? But why? I mean, this is a little spooky because you and I have only just been talking about it. In fact, as far as listeners are concerned, this very week.
Really, we have. It's a special episode that we finally did about When Harry Met Sally, the most non-declared, but definitely clearly Jewish film ever made. And we had the special episode for our Patreon friends and family, which you can check that out in the show notes if you want to find that episode. And yes, it was quite farsighted of us because, as you said, now comes those news, that news on Yashar Ali. He's an American journalist on X, writing that this is what Meg Ryan is saying with that footage of that picture of them sitting on the couch. It's quite exciting.
Yeah, I thought so. I mean, who knows what it will be? They look like they would look 35 years on from the film. I think that's fair to say. But you know, she looked great. He looked sort of cozy and slightly grandfatherly. But it's very, very intriguing. We get into all of this, as you say, if you are a subscriber to us on Patreon, part of the friends and family of the podcast. We do generally encourage you to do this. You will hear us waxing verbose and loving about When Harry Met Sally, the Jewishness of the film, the endurance of it. It's one of our bonus episodes.
And also, who among us is just high maintenance and who's a high maintenance and thinks they're low maintenance?
Yes.
That's a spoiler question.
I hope you're not giving anything away there. I was just going to say, is there a Jewish person in the world who is low maintenance? Question.
Nah.
And what levels of self-delusion would there have to be a Jewish person and think you're low maintenance? I just don't know how unself-aware you would have to be. That just comes with our territory. But yes, you can listen to that if you are a subscriber and you get our bonus episodes.
So that could be very exciting cinematic news or celebrity news, but I think we should talk about what is happening here on the ground, which is, we recorded our special episode about the update of the hostages coming back, Emily Damari and Doron Steinbrecher and Romi Gonen, and that sort of moment where you realized it's still a possibility, even after 471 days, for them to come back alive. We're recording this on Thursday evening. On Saturday, what is supposed to happen is that another group of women, 4 women, according to the agreement, are supposed to come out. In the agreement, it's quite detailed. So Israel asked for the civilians first, the women who are not soldiers, and then the soldiers. So we can figure out who might be coming back. It's Arbel Yahud, who was a civilian. She was kidnapped from Nir Oz. And then there are the 5 Outlook soldiers who were abducted from Nachal Oz base. We all know their names by heart at this point. It's Naama and Liri and Karina and Agam and Daniela. 3 out of them are supposed to be coming home. That, of course, will be an extremely emotional moment for Israelis. In the meantime, the big dramatic headline of this week is, of course, the fact that the Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, the IDF Chief of Staff, resigned. He will officially leave his post at the beginning of March. This is a man that has been carrying that heavy weight of October 7th on his shoulders, and his face showed it. And it was very clear from the beginning, him actually saying it, that the moment will arrive and he will not end his term as the IDF chief of staff.
Yeah, I mean, one of those things that we knew was coming. I think we knew it was coming extremely soon after the 7th of October, 2023, because he said, I will take responsibility when the moment is ripe. And what he meant by that was when we're not in a war situation. And so the ceasefire has enabled him to step down and to take responsibility. And there have been a series of other, resignations in dribs and drabs since October 7th. And each one, I think, merits the same response, which is good for them for putting their hands up and taking responsibility for what was an epic failure. But it's a failure shared by many hands. And the singular group who have not taken any responsibility remains the politicians on whose watch this happened. So the military echelon have said this was a terrible fail by us to allow Israel to be attacked in the most extreme attack in Israel's history. And his departure before his term was done is his acceptance of that. But it just throws the spotlight more brightly on Prime Minister Netanyahu and others who have not made the same move. In fact, you think about it, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he's now gone. It is Netanyahu who stands there very obviously, who not only has not taken responsibility, but has not actually even allowed the process by which responsibility might be allocated to go forward. And what I have in mind there is a vote that happened this week, in the same week that Herzi Halevi steps down. Once again, Netanyahu's coalition votes against there being a state commission of inquiry, which there has to be into this. And so I think he's done something he had to do, something we knew would happen, but that is in its own way admirable, because it says responsibility does still exist in Israel. And that's a message the politicians need to hear, I think.
He said, my responsibility for the terrible failure accompanies me every day, every hour, and be so for the rest of my life. I will relate to what you said about the politicians in Israel, but I would want to pause for a moment and talk about Herzi Halevi, because you and I are both history buffs, and I think the tragedy of this man is something that we kind of need to, the tragedy of this man and consequently the tragedy of this country is something that we kind of need to focus on. Herzi Halevi was the anointed one. He was the chosen one. It was very clear from the very beginning, almost of his military career that spanned almost 4 decades, he will be the chief of staff. I remember this piece written by Jody Redorn for the New York Times, a profile about the then Brigadier General Halevi. He was the commander of the Northern Galilee region. This is a piece from 2013, marking him as who might well be someday the chief of staff, a philosopher general, she calls him, which is what Herzi Halevi has been called his whole life, this sort of deep thinker, this intellectual, this man who actually took the positions that should have made him Mr. Gaza, right? He was the head of the Southern Command. He was the head of military intelligence. He did everything right. But on that fateful morning and that sort of famous, now infamous kind of call at 4 a.m., when he's on the line with the head of the Central Command, the head of the operations unit in the military, and they're seeing the signs from Gaza, and they're saying to themselves, they're saying, okay, maybe this is this, but it might burn the sources. Let's wait till morning. That fateful decision. Now, it's never, obviously, when there's a failure of this, as you called it, epic proportions, it's never one man. It's always a litany and years of mistakes being made. But on that, he will never be rid of that mistake and the mistakes that followed on that day. And I'm just thinking of this man who, people who met him before he became chief of staff noticed that he was reading the biographies of all of the chiefs of staff that came before him. In hindsight, maybe the only relevant one was, of course, the one written by David Elazar Dado, who was the chief of staff in the Yom Kippur War. But you think of that, a person who was preparing his whole life to take that role and then making the fateful mistake that, of course, takes everything off the rails. It's just something that I think of, and obviously he's been targeted by the Israeli right for the specific reason that you were mentioning, to take off the pressure from the prime minister. All of this was leading up to him resigning and, of course, taking the responsibility. And it does indeed shed the light on the fact that the prime minister himself did not, by the way, quotes of a conversation between Herzi Halevi and the defense minister, the new defense minister Israel Katz, coming out on our network, and this conversation, which is quite unbelievable, in which Katz is saying, reprimanding the chief of staff, saying responsibility is not a vague term. People were murdered. You are the head of this system. Something happened here. The word responsibility has meaning. There are families and they deserve explanations. This is said by the minister of defense to the head of the military when the prime minister is not, who really is the head of the system, right, is not taking responsibility. It's quite an amazing, these are quite amazing quotes.
We don't want to get ahead of our chutzpah nomination, but to do that when you are voting for there to be no inquiry, when you're saying these families deserve answers. Just 2 points, one about the past and one about the future. So the point about the future I would make is that now I think it's fair to say there will be a battle for the succession inside the IDF, and that is always political, but now even more so. And there is to be a round of appointments of generals, because so many senior commanders were anyway due for retirement, but also some did. There have been resignations, and I think you will see a cultural split between, in a way, that IDF that Herzi Halevi embodied, that was picked up in that New York Times piece you mentioned, which is this very sort of thoughtful type of commander who is keen to, always be bound by democratic norms, by legal norms, on the one hand, and then on the other you have some figures in the military who have swum with the tide of this coalition government, who are, just as you've seen in the police, there are some police figures who are right there with the agenda of Itamar Ben-Gvir. There are in the military some people who, are there with the coalition, and others who perhaps have seen themselves as a kind of restraining influence. And I think there'll be, as there always is in the Israel Defense Forces, a sort of cultural tussle between those two different philosophies. Just the thing I was going to say about the history was just because of that quote you gave us from Herzi Halevi about how he will carry this with him for the rest of his life. I think that there's something quite Israeli about that historically. Menachem Begin, after the huge losses, and they were fewer, obviously, than have been involved this time, but Israeli losses in Lebanon, he sort of retreated from Israeli public life. He became a kind of hermit figure. It was said that he was actually depressed and weighed down by what had happened, and he did eventually resign as prime minister. That's what I think people expect from people who have been in any way implicated in a lethal failure like this. So Herzi Halevi, to talk about being haunted by this, puts him in that kind of tradition. We see no sign of that guilty conscience, that weight on the shoulders of the prime minister. And I think, again, it's an emotional point rather than a political point, but that is a missing piece this time, and it was not missing in previous experiences that Israel has gone through.
Yes, we should also add that the head of the Southern Command, Yaron Finkelman, took that note from Herzi Halevi and also resigned. That was also to be expected. And we will remind our listeners that the head of military intelligence, Aaron Khaliva, has already resigned. So the three main sort of generals connected to this failure are leaving. The next person that will probably be pressured by Netanyahu to leave, and also said that he is responsible and took responsibility, as head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. And again, that would just point a heavier hand at the politicians. None of them moved an inch since the big failure of October 7th.
They didn't. So we are now able, in some ways, to talk about the war as this is at least a full stop, even if it's not a paragraph. It created this space in which the chief of staff felt he could step down. In that breathing space, there have been a couple of developments I think we should talk about. One is that in a way the focus has been able to move elsewhere. And so you mentioned him, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, saying the battle against Palestinian terrorism in the West Bank is now at the top of the military's and of Israel's priorities, said that in a statement. I'm sure he didn't refer to it as the West Bank. But the point there being that now that there is a ceasefire against Hamas, there has been, it's a patchy one, but 8 weeks or so of a ceasefire or a cessation with Hezbollah in the north. It means there is energy, there's capacity, there's person power to deploy in the West Bank, and we've seen that this week with this big operation in Jenin, a city historically that has been, a hotbed of militancy, resistance, whichever word you want to use, going right back to the 30s.
Terrorism is fine on this end.
Well, I was thinking going back even, into the pre-state period. But there's been a big operation there in which I think estimated 10 Palestinians killed, hundreds at one point rounded up. I think the really interesting thing about this is that this is not just Israel acting alone. The Palestinian Authority has also been engaged there. That's partly because it too sees Hamas, a resurgent Hamas, a growing Hamas, as a threat to its authority. But there are some who are wondering about the politics of this too, and whether or not there has been a desire by some in the government, some in the coalition, to sort of whack the beehive a bit and to cause trouble that might lead to there being a break in the ceasefire. In other words, if there's trouble elsewhere, you can say, well, obviously now we can't be in any kind of arrangement with Hamas. I don't know about that, but it's not as if people are thinking, right, there's now quiet. There's just the end. The fight has moved elsewhere. And the other thing to talk about is that we talked about the hostages going home. The people of Gaza, remembering nearly 2 million people, Palestinians displaced in Gaza, have been going back home. A headline in the Financial Times this week, which sort of captured it, the headline, Gazans return home to nothing. And it followed people going back to their streets, their neighbourhoods, which are just rubble, and quite what will be entailed to rebuild there, just absolutely flattened. And you see some of the photographs. It does look as if an earthquake has hit those places. That is also part of the story of this post-ceasefire deal week, which is, it's still less than a week old as you and I speak.
Yes, and everything on both sides still very shaky. We should remember we're talking on Thursday. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas started on Sunday. The first hostage release started on the same day. So we're looking forward to 38 days of this, the first stage, and then, according to the deal, another 42 days of the end of the war and the return of all of the hostages. This is still a very, very shaky road to walk on at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's held for this long, and there were some people who wondered if it would last even this number of hours, let alone days. So, so far, so good, but absolutely, it's perilous.
So this week on Monday, Donald J. Trump is the president of the United States again. In the words of Ronald Reagan, here you go again. I mean, on the one hand, you listen to his inauguration speech, and you realize that the world has become quite a complicated place. I mean, you have to be able to hold in your head things like a denial of climate change, denial of gender fluidity, what is it with taking back territory, renaming things, all of that. And also, as an Israeli, to think of the fact that perhaps without him sending his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East to say to Netanyahu, please sign on the dotted line, sir, we wouldn't be talking and sitting here and saying hostages have been released. So it's a very mixed bag, I would say, of the fact that Trump is back. When you think of the targeting of civil servants, especially in the FBI and the Justice Department, when you think of targeting the media, think of targeting the judiciary, definitely a few things that Netanyahu and Trump still have in common.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Netanyahu will have been taking notes from that inaugural speech and just thinking, well, which one of these can I do? I mean, the idea, we're going to come back onto it, but for me, the pardoning of 1,500 people convicted for crimes related to the attempted insurrection on January the 6th, 2021, including people convicted of violence, including against police officers and then being just pardoned and given the green light, as if to say political violence is now okay as long
While
as it's...
talking about the problem of crime in America in your inauguration speech, one should add.
Yeah, and then saying, I want to be a peacemaker, but meanwhile, the Panama Canal is ours and we're going to have it back. So we want it back. We're going to take it back. So full of contradictions. I just want to, because I think it is gaining ground, this idea of, well, say what you like about Donald Trump, but it's thanks to him we've got the hostages back. That view. I would just say put the counter view, which is the only reason the hostage deal was so delayed was by the existence of Donald Trump. It was because Joe Biden was in an election year, and that is, but perhaps all sides, but certainly Netanyahu thought, I'm going to hold out because I might get a better deal with the new guy. That's partly one of, there's many moving parts here, but that was one of the reasons why this took so long. You always had this potential, other customer on the other side of the street that made Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, he talked about it too, feel they should play for time and get the deal with him. In other words, had this been Joe Biden without the possibility of an election and somebody else coming along, I'm not sure that this deal wouldn't have been done quite a long time ago. Nevertheless, he did do it. And the big rally he had straight after his inaugural speech, and this is a whole, fascinating study right there, because he gave this quite rigid inaugural speech and then let himself be unleashed in an immediate speech he gave to the overflow service. Those people who get tickets for higher holiday services will know all about the overflow service. This was just like that when he was in another room. And then later on at the Capital One Arena, that was him sort of unbuttoned. He talked all about, his... he sort of let his id run rampant. And there I think you saw a whole lot of kind of contradictions, because on the one hand, he wants to say that he is going to be the president under whom wars don't start, they end. Yet he also says that he wants to see Hamas completely gone. That means... How do you read that then? Is that a green light to stopping and continue with the ceasefire? Or is that a green light for those who want to resume the war in Gaza? That goes two different ways. That's contradictory. But another thing that just leapt out at me, and I think, we may come to it, but he invited on stage released hostages, Noah Argamani, and then hostage families, relatives, to stand beside him, behind him, as he spoke. And the first line he said, as he sort of welcomed them, was, we're going to free the J6 hostages too, he said to them. Meaning the people convicted of crimes on January the 6th, he immediately equated them to people who were taken from their homes or from a music festival and held by Hamas. To me, it was extraordinarily an insulting thing to say. And he then had them behind him as props while he unleashed all this partisan venom against Biden, against Democrats. And you had Noah Argamani, of all people, having to stand there behind him, applauding, using them as pawns like that. I found it all very hard to stomach. No one's going to be surprised to hear that. But I do think there are all kinds of contradictory signals on everything, but certainly in terms of what his next moves will be for Israel.
I mean, there are two main questions here. One is the Saudi deal, and it does sound like when you hear what Waltz is saying and you hear the rest of the administration talking, that is something that Trump wants. And the other question is Iran. Will the United States join in with Israel in an attack of the nuclear sites? It doesn't sound like that is what Trump is planning. When you listen to J.D. Vance before the election saying, we're not exactly aligned with Israel on the issue of Iran, and reiterating that I'm a peacemaker thing, I think those are the two areas where Israel is a little trepidatious and is watching closely. To me, that point about the hostages that you make, I just wanted to make that note that it seems like it's a very again, from someone seeing it from The View in Tel Aviv, it does seem like it is a bipartisan issue in the United States. I mean, that both Republicans and Democrats are very much with the hostage families. You saw this in the conventions before the elections, but we see it now as well, that this is something that unites both parties. It's sad to say it's not necessarily that way here in Israel, but one of the hostage advocates said to Trump famously already, she said, you get us the hostages, we get you a Nobel Peace Prize. I think that is a way to talk to him. I mean, that is something that might convince him to move forward in that regard. The fact that there were so many contradictions, well, that is Donald Trump, and that is where we are. We're back in that world, right? Where we wake up at 6 a.m. and just look at our phone and say, he wants
What's
to
he
buy
done now?
Greenland again.
Yeah. What's he done now?
We're back
No,
in that world.
but look, I agree about the Nobel Peace Prize. No joke. He genuinely does want that. It still rankles with him that Obama got one. He, so quickly, he felt because, Obama hadn't really done anything. And it's true, Obama hadn't done much when he got one. Any prize that he hasn't yet got, Trump wants. And the idea of a transactional deal, I had somebody making this point, you don't now even have to say it's good for America. You just have to say it's good for Donald Trump. So all credit to that advocate for the hostages for thinking of that, because that is the right pitch. And that is indeed why a Saudi deal would be appealing to him. He is a deal maker. We get that. And that's the way to work on him. Your point about the consensus, though, I think you've put your finger on by mentioning that, why I was so unnerved by the sight of those hostages behind him, not just, them being there, that's okay, but the idea of them standing there and applauding when he was making absolutely aggressive partisan points, talking about Biden didn't know what he was doing, he was the worst president ever. Biden, and they're all standing there applauding in their yellow scarves, right? That's not great, because you need it to be a consensus bipartisan issue. Biden did a lot to get these hostages out. He was very involved with those families, we know, and the actual agreement is the agreement he and his team brokered. Yes, maybe it took Trump's arrival to drag it across the line, but I think.
But you're completely right that they brokered it.
Yeah, and to get them to allow themselves to be drawn in as if they are the partisan sort of backdrop for one side rather than another, and indeed against the other. I don't think that's wise.
I don't know what choice they had in the moment, but I think you mentioned
none.
President Biden, and I will want to say, look, there are Israelis that were upset at what looked at it for a moment as a limited arms embargo. There were Israelis who were upset on the issue of humanitarian aid. They thought that would be the leverage to release the hostages. And when the Biden administration was pushing Israel on that, Israel lost the leverage. I think it's important to say, as we sit here, and he's now former President Biden, that Joe Biden came to Israel in the first days of the war, which is something no American president ever did. He said to Israel's enemies, don't try us. He sat and set up a coalition when Iran attacked Israel, and he gave Israel, if I'm not mistaken, $19 billion in aid during this war. So, and beyond that, I think it's important to say that whatever you think about parts of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden is a person who cares for Israel deeply. I don't think you can question that. You can say a lot of things about the policies in the Middle East and whatever the consequences of those policies were. I don't think you can question the man who stepped down on January 20th is a man who cares for the state of Israel deeply.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. On your point about humanitarian aid, I think what you said there was in a way more transparent than we ever did here from the Israeli government, because you said there were some hostage families who thought, look, it might be useful as a way as leverage to get the hostages home.
I mean, they said that if there's no humanitarian aid coming into the hostages, there might not be humanitarian aid coming in. Hamas abusing that. If there's a way to bring food to people who need it, great. But Hamas is abusing the humanitarian aid.
So that argument, and but the argument you would hear from Israeli government spokesmen around the country was, what are you talking about? Just last week, I mean, just before the ceasefire, you would hear them saying, what are you talking about? The aid is all going through. This is a complete invention. Then the day after the ceasefire, you see suddenly 600 or more trucks rolling through. You realize, okay, it was being held up. And so now it's a different rate of flow of aid is going in. That's happened as a result of ceasefire. That at least be sort of clearer about that, rather than there was this slightly gaslighting thing going on of telling everyone, no, it's going through. And then suddenly you see, 6 times the volume. And just by the way, on JD Vance, I mean, he's not been vice president for a week yet. And yet the notion that you can really take anything he says as a guide to the administration, he said that just before the inauguration, that absolutely they would not consider pardoning those people who'd been convicted of violence against police officers. Of course not. We would look on it on a case-by-case basis. Trump gets in and just says, right, we're going to do a blanket pardon for the lot of them. There's JD Vance left with egg on his face. I think, whatever remarks he made about Iran, I don't think you can set too much store by them. There's only one decider in this administration, and it's Donald Trump. And what anybody else says may have been true 5 minutes ago, but it may change within minutes because Trump goes his own way.
Yeah, and by the way, just one more thing to say about JD Vance. He's an isolationist. I don't think he has necessarily any sort of deep connection to the state of Israel. I think there are a lot of people, and the president is 78 years old. That is something that I think a lot of people here are watching as well. We need to talk about Elon Musk, I think, right?
We really do. I mean, this is one of those ones where I don't know if how you first saw this, but people were talking about it before I'd seen it. And I consciously thought, I bet it's not going to be what they're all saying. There's no way he did oh my God, he did an actual Z Carl salute. You watch it again. And it's a funny impulse I have with these things because I really wanted it not to be, because it's awful if it is. But I don't think there's any other way of seeing it. And, somebody said, oh, no, he was there giving his heart to the crowd. There is a gesture when you do that, but it involves both hands as if your heart is bursting. And I'm doing it now.
Doesn't
YouTube
look like
viewers
that.
Can see it. It doesn't look anything like this. This was the sort of thumping of the chest followed by the straight arm, straight angled hand and arm. It's an unambiguous Hitler salute. And we shouldn't be surprised, because this is a guy who look at who he supports around the world. He supports the ultra far right. It came out recently that he subscribes to a seriously white supremacist pro-apartheid newsletter in South Africa. This is kind of who he is. And what was in a way more striking about the whole episode was this very unseemly scramble afterwards from people to say, what you saw with your own eyes, you didn't see with your own eyes. And I think, unfortunately, we have to mention the Anti-Defamation League here, the ADL, that exists to monitor this kind of behaviour, saying it was an awkward gesture, their phrase, made by Elon Musk. But, in this moment of grace, a transition, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Translation, this is a really powerful guy. We don't want to be on the wrong side of him right now. So let's just pretend we didn't see what we all saw. Not good.
Look, I mean, this is an unacceptable hands gesture. I'm just thinking back to 2005. This is in your neighborhood, sir. But Prince Harry, I think, went as a Nazi officer for Halloween. This was a scandal that lasted, you tell me, but weeks, right? I mean, this was something that no one saw. He, to this day, thinks it's one of his biggest mistakes. He talked about it today. And the fact that this could we could breeze over this, whatever. And the IDL said this, and he himself said. So people are like debating this. Is this indeed a Roman salute or it's a Nazi salute, which is sort of the same thing? Never mind. All of this is just ridiculous. You are an incredibly powerful man. Don't do this. Don't make these hands gestures. The main thing I would say about him is the worrying thing here is the cozying up to the extreme right around the world. And the fact that his platform is, how shall we say this delicately, not being great in combating anti-Semitism. That's the most, courteous way I could phrase this. These are the things that are worrying, I think, people around the world. This hand gesture is just, if you want to do something that makes you look like you're auditioning to be the villain in a Bond film, you have the gadgets and the weird hand gestures, great. But I think the things to talk about really are what is going on his platform, what is going on in his, political agenda. These are the things that are really concerning. And when you add that to the fact that you have people pardoned after wearing a T-shirt that says Camp Auschwitz, all this together is not a pretty picture.
No, it isn't. And I think you're absolutely right to mention the platform. It's not just a sort of failure of moderation. He invited those people back on. They had been banned, the far right, a whole lot of neo-Nazis, and they suddenly were back on. And look, leave the evidence, leave the judgment to the far right white supremacist neo-Nazi groups themselves, who loved this. They were all sharing it, tweeting it. He's one of us. Think great things are happening. This is exciting. They knew what it was. Let's not all pretend. I thought Elise Stefanik, who's Trump's nominee to be United States ambassador to the United Nations, she was asked about this in the Senate. She goes, he did not make that gesture. It's that idea, or there is a kind of gaslighting dimension there, where you say to people, he didn't do what you just saw he did. That's ridiculous. If you've got some other explanation, fine, offer it, but don't try and tell us that he didn't do it. We know the man's record, we know his politics, I think, and the fact that he is, I think by some distance, the most powerful advisor to the president. The president clearly feels he owes him. He got $270 million worth of support. And more importantly, perhaps, this huge chunk of the attention economy. Ezra Klein, previously a guest on this podcast, talks about the attention oligarchy. And that's who was there at the inauguration. Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook. They were all there. He understands, I think, Donald Trump, that this is the kind of currency of our world, and Elon Musk has a lot of it. And therefore, suddenly, they feel a bit invincible. And I think that's what that gesture was conveying. You can't touch me, even when I do this.
So just to tell our listeners now that we're both going to get kicked off X, that Jonathan also has a Blue Sky account, and I'm also on Instagram, but I would just end this argument. It's not even an argument. I would end this discussion. I'm surprised I'm the one who's reading this out, not you. Benjamin Netanyahu, who tweeted out, the Israeli prime minister, Elon Musk is being falsely smeared. Elon is a great friend of Israel. He visited Israel after the October 7th massacre in which Hamas terrorists committed the worst atrocity against the Jewish people. He has since repeatedly and forcibly supported Israel's right to defend itself. So that, just
yeah, I mean,
you can say whatever you want.
I've seen that statement, and what it's part of is a phenomenon which we've seen for years now, which is this divergence between the diaspora's interests and Israel's interests, because there's a group of people like
Prime
this.
Minister's interests. Just let's be specific.
Well, and the Prime Minister's own interest. No, but I mean, there are people around the world who are really problematic on Jews who are nevertheless pro-Israel. That's what I was drawing attention to. So you have somebody like Viktor Orban, who can run a whole election campaign using anti-Semitic tropes about George Soros, will also be all in behind Israel. And that is, people can write a doctoral thesis on why that is. But this is just another example of it. It doesn't work to say this is a terrible smear, this guy is pro-Israel. We know that some of these far-right people have their own warped reasons for being pro-Israel. It doesn't detract from what he did, which was a Nazi salute at a big public gathering in the United States on the day of a presidential inauguration. We should be stunned by that. Before we get to our awards, just to note that obviously a very big anniversary is coming up on Monday. It will be the 80th anniversary of the liberation by the Red Army of Auschwitz-Birkenau. January the 27th has become, around the world, sort of the day for Holocaust Memorial. It's the official sort of government-sponsored day here in Britain, but in many, many places. There'll be lots of ceremonies. There'll be lots of reflections on all of that. As it happens, I'm not going to be here for our podcast next week. Someone else will be in this chair. But we will be doing our own sort of reflections on what it means for the Shoah to be 80 years behind us. In an upcoming episode, we've got some thoughts about people we want to talk about that with. So I just want to put down that we are definitely very aware of this. We're going to be and talking about it in some depth in the coming weeks, because 2025 is a big year for those anniversaries, and there'll be several of them as the year unfolds.
And if you want to be prepared for all that, I would recommend a very great book by the great Jonathan Friedland, The Escape Artist. I think that's an important book to read. If you haven't yet, this is the time to do it. Chutzpah and Mensch Awards, sir?
Well, we must end, I think, with our Mensch Awards. So I'm going to, if I can be cheeky, I want to nominate a Chutzpah Award. I think we've touched on it. But I also have a mention, at least, for Mensch. But here we are for the Chutzpah Award. We've already talked about it. I think Donald Trump's, I know he's a serial winner of this. And like I've said before, very happy to give him the Mensch Award when he brings all the hostages home, as that hostage advocate said to him. But to do that equation and to say that to Noah Argamani and other people held by Hamas, I'm going to release the J6 hostages. It seemed to me to take chutzpah to new depths, because what it did was to put those hostages, the Israelis and others held by Hamas, on the same moral plane as people who tried to overturn an election and did so by violence. And that is a huge and hideous insult. And so I think that's a chutzpah award for him. But I think you have a nominee too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the newspaper, one of the Haredi newspaper, Yated Ne'eman, perhaps, who called we know we talked about this a lot, the discussion in Israel about the attempt to conscript people who have been studying Torah, the ultra-Orthodox, into the military, a whole big discussion, argument in Israel. So there was this article calling the people who might be arrested if they're not going into military service as hostages. I mean, please don't use that word unless it is where it belongs. That is our request. Mensch Awards, can we do that? Can I do that?
You can. I mean, it is absolutely common. It's a common theme, isn't it, there in our Chutzpah Award? The mention I was just going to make in passing was, and listeners who know anything about my football allegiances will know why this is a big deal. I'm a big supporter of Arsenal Football Club.
No, I did not know that.
Our deadly rivals here in North London are Tottenham Hotspur, but I'm going to give a mention to Tottenham Hotspur for their support and campaigning for Emily Damari, one of the hostages, the only British-Israeli hostage still left, who was released and freed last Sunday. Spurs had really got behind her case, and she did a kind of video message for them, wearing the scarves of the club, thanking them for her support. And this chant, I think I referred to it the other day, but it's very moving, the chant, because it's normally directed at young players. She's one of our own, they were chanting about her. And so that bond between her and them, I think a collective Mensch Award to the football club and the supporters for Tottenham Hotspur. I think it will be the last time I do that to the deadly rivals, but there we are.
Arsenal fan gives Mensch Award to Spurs. I mean, wow, that is the headline of our episode this week, for sure.
It might just be.
So just an extra Mensch Award, if we can, to Yuval Rafael. She's the survivor of the Nova massacre, and she will represent Israel at the 2025 Eurovision. She won a reality program on Channel 12 here in Israel, and that means she'll be chosen to represent Israel. She sang, I think one of the songs that she sang was Abba's Dancing Queen. She said she dedicated it to all the angels who were murdered at the festival, and said music was one of the strong ingredients that helped her heal. I think this is just it's a lovely story, and she's an incredibly talented woman, and we wish her best of luck in this endeavor of hers. We remember the pictures of Eden Golan last year and how her hotel was, under the security details she had to go with for the Eurovision contest. Hopefully, this is not something that Yuval will have to suffer, but perhaps it still is. And we are close to the end of our program. Jonathan won't be here next week. Someone else will be in his chair. It's a mystery. We're not going to reveal it.
We're not going to reveal that just yet. No, apologies, but just duty in other duties call. But I will be back in this chair, I think, and I hope 2 weeks from now. I look forward to listening next week. And remember, bonus episode, When Harry Met Sally. You'd be crazy not to listen to it, especially now that we don't know what it is, but something iconic is coming, says Meg Ryan.
So be prepared.
So be prepared for that. You have to become a subscriber on Patreon.
Well, Sarah, thank you to Michal Porat, and we'll be back next time.